All right, welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at international schools,
Sounds interesting.
but we're going beyond just like the basics.
Oh, okay.
We're going to dig deep into how these schools shape student identity, especially when we're talking about national identity.
Definitely.
It's going to be interesting. We've got a really good mix of stuff to look at for this. We've got academic papers, articles from the International Educator, even peeking at some of these school websites
Yeah. Oh,
to
wow.
see how they present themselves.
Mm.
So get ready, because some of what we found might, well, it might just challenge your assumptions about what international really means,
Mm.
at least in the education world.
Right. It's funny you say that because it seems like the very definition of an international school is constantly changing.
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, even the international educator kind of admits that it's a moving target.
It is. And when you look at some schools, like take the Western Academy of Beijing or this old foreign school, for example, when you look at their websites, they really highlight how diverse their students and faculty are.
Okay.
But it goes beyond just the numbers. They're actively promoting multilingualism. They value the students' first languages,
Uh-huh.
and they host all these cultural events. It's like they're really trying to build this image of a global community within their schools.
Yeah. I see what you mean. And it is interesting how they're really working to create a specific type of environment.
Yeah.
It's not just sort of happening organically. It makes you wonder, though, if this global community that they're presenting is really well representative, or is it just kind of, I don't know, maybe glossing over the real, I guess the real struggles that come with navigating all these different cultures.
That's a good point. It really is. And it makes me think about the money side of things, too.
Oh, right.
We all know international schools aren't exactly, cheap.
Right.
But the stuff in global impacts of international education was kind of shocking, I gotta say. They're saying by 2025, the annual fees for these schools could reach $67.3 billion globally.
Wow, that's a huge number. And it really shows just how powerful this whole industry is. It's not even just about education at this point. It's about money, global investment,
Right.
and even the potential to change local economies in some places.
Yeah, and that's what makes me wonder about the ripple effects,
Yeah, right.
Like, on one hand, you've got job creation. Maybe it attracts new businesses to the area, even whole expat communities.
That's true.
But on the other hand, could all this money coming in actually drive up the cost of living for everyone else?
Right.
What happens to the communities around these schools in the long run?
Well, that's where things get a little more complicated, I think. I mean, all this money can be a good thing. Obviously, it can help things grow,
Of course.
but it can also make existing inequalities worse. It's almost like a bubble could form around these schools, and that just widens the gap between the people who have a lot and the people who don't.
And that makes me think about third culture kids, or TCKs as they're called.
Oh, yeah.
It's something I've always been curious about. We're going to really get into their world in a bit.
Okay.
And I want to know how all this money flowing into international schools actually affects their lives, too.
Right.
Like, does it make them feel isolated? Does it make it hard to fit in with the local communities?
Yeah, those are good questions. And they lead us right into this whole fascinating world of TCKs.
So TCKs, third culture kids, these are kids growing up surrounded by cultures that are different from their parents.
Right.
It's fascinating, really. I remember reading this book, Third Culture Kids. It was by David Pollock and Ruth Van Ryken. The Experience of Growing Up Among Worlds. That was the subtitle.
Yeah.
And it really made me see the unique challenges and opportunities that these kids face.
Yeah. It's an area that I find really interesting, too. I mean, these kids, they develop this amazing ability to adapt, They have this global awareness, and a lot of them speak multiple languages. It's like they're navigating this really complex world from such a young age.
Right.
And that experience really builds resilience and gives them a totally different perspective.
I can see that. I actually have a friend who grew up as a TCK,
Mm.
and she was constantly moving, like between different continents even.
Wow.
And she can speak 4 languages fluently. And she connects with people from all kinds of backgrounds so easily. It's really amazing to see how comfortable she is, in all these different cultural settings.
That's really common for TCKs, but it's not always easy for them. I mean, as Ellen Mahoney writes, all that moving around can lead to a sense of not really belonging anywhere.
Oh, I bet.
It can be hard to form relationships that last, and to really feel like you belong somewhere. Imagine having to answer the question, where are you from? when
Yeah.
home isn't just one place. It's all these different experiences, these memories scattered all over the world.
Wow. Yeah. That must be so disorienting. It makes me wonder, though, does all the money that's associated with these international schools, does that make things even more complicated for TCKs?
Hmm.
Like, does it create this bubble that separates them even more from the local communities?
It's definitely something to think about. I mean, the potential for them to feel isolated is there,
Mhm.
especially when you have situations where, like, the TCK families have a lot more money than the people in the community around them.
Right, right.
So then it becomes a question of, well, how can these international schools bridge that gap?
Yeah,
How can they help TCKs really connect with the local culture?
exactly. So how do these schools, and we've talked about how many of them are really rooted in Western educational models,
Yeah.
how do they balance that with respecting the values and traditions of the countries they're in?
Mm.
It's like, how do they educate global citizens while also being sensitive to local cultures?
Well, that's the big challenge, isn't it? It's about navigating all these different cultural expectations, and sometimes those expectations clash. To take Vietnam as an example, their national education system is really focused on socialist values.
Uh-huh.
But then you have these international schools that might have a more, I don't know, maybe a more individualistic approach, more of a Western way of thinking.
Yeah, that sounds like there's bound to be some tension there.
Definitely. And it's not just Vietnam. We see this kind of dynamic in a lot of other countries too, like Malaysia, for
Yeah.
example. Students there might be dealing with very westernized norms in the classroom, but at home, they're expected to follow more traditional values.
Right.
It's this constant back and forth between two very different cultural frameworks.
It's like they're living in two worlds at the same time. That has to be so tough, especially for teenagers.
Yeah.
They're already trying to figure out who they are.
Absolutely. And then you have cases like in Cyprus, where the main language used in international schools is Greek.
Okay.
And that can create a huge barrier for students who don't speak Greek.
Oh, wow.
So even though it's supposed to be this international environment, they can still end up feeling left out.
It's almost ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like the very place that's meant to bring people together from different cultures could actually end up creating even more inequality.
Right, right. It just goes to show that you can't just throw a bunch of cultures together and expect everything to be, perfect. You have to be really intentional about it. You have to deal with things like power dynamics and language barriers and these potential clashes between cultures. And that's where some international schools are doing some really innovative stuff.
Really?
They're coming up with ways to bridge these divides.
That's good to hear. So what are they doing? What are some of the approaches they're taking?
Well, one thing they're doing is trying to incorporate more local culture and history into the actual curriculum.
Oh, okay.
So instead of just treating the host country like it's just, background scenery, they're bringing it into the classroom. They're taking kids on field trips to historical sites. They're having local experts come in and give talks. They're even using local literature and art in their lessons.
So it's about giving the students some context, helping them really understand the place they're living in.
Exactly. It's about helping them feel connected to the place, even if they're only there for a short time. Another thing that's becoming more common is promoting multilingualism.
Okay.
So instead of just focusing on English, a lot of schools are starting to offer heritage language programs, and they're encouraging students to keep speaking their native languages.
I love that. It's like they're acknowledging all the linguistic diversity that the students bring with them. And language is such a big part of who we are,
Mhm.
our cultural heritage.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about preserving languages. It's about recognizing that language is a huge part of someone's identity. When you value a student's native language, you're valuing them as a person.
Right. It sends such a good message. What else are these schools doing?
Well, a lot of them are also starting to partner with local communities more.
Oh, that's great.
So they might get involved in projects to preserve local heritage or collaborate with local organizations or encourage their students to volunteer in the community.
So they're breaking down that bubble, that international school bubble.
Yeah, exactly. They're creating opportunities for real interaction, for genuine exchange between the students and the local community.
I like that. And this is where I think UNESCO's World Heritage Education Program is doing such great work.
Definitely.
They're really encouraging young people to get involved in protecting cultural and natural heritage sites all over the world.
It's a perfect fit, really. I mean, imagine if international schools really embraced that idea. Imagine students from all over the world coming together to preserve the heritage of the country they're living in.
That would be amazing.
Right. Whether they're restoring a historic building or, documenting local traditions, it's about instilling this sense of shared responsibility. It goes way beyond just classroom learning.
It's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we're not just citizens of the world, but we're also members of these specific communities, each with its own unique history and culture.
Exactly. And it's about using the resources that these international schools have and their global connections to really amplify the voices and experiences of those local communities.
So it's not just about bringing the world into the classroom. It's also about taking the classroom out into the world.
Yeah, and really engaging with the local community.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think rather than seeing international schools as these isolated places, we should view them as potential bridges between cultures. Places that can facilitate dialogue and understanding and even collaboration on issues that we all care about.
I like that. It's not just about this idea of a global melting pot where everyone's the same. It's about acknowledging that we all have our own distinct cultural identities, and it's important to preserve those.
Right.
But it's also about finding meaningful ways to connect across those differences.
It sounds like a tricky balance to strike, but a really important one.
It is. And it requires us to be willing to adapt and to learn and to challenge our own assumptions about what it means to be a global citizen.
Speaking of challenging assumptions, there's one more aspect of international schools that we haven't talked about yet,
Okay.
and that's how they go about promoting diversity and inclusion. And there's one school in particular that really caught our eye. We were just talking about how some international schools are really stepping up their game when it comes to diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
And there's this one school that we came across in our research, the Sri Ram Academy in Hyderabad. And they were featured in this article about how international schools promote cultural diversity. Their approach just seemed, I don't know, really thoughtful.
Yeah, they're a great example of a school that's really putting these ideas into action. They've got a really diverse faculty. They make sure to include lots of different perspectives in their curriculum, and they're always celebrating different cultures.
Right.
It's not just like a checklist for them, Diversity and inclusion are like built into who they are as a school.
But it does make you wonder, is it enough? I mean, can these kinds of efforts really bridge that gap between global and local perspectives? We talked about how international schools can sometimes create these bubbles of affluence.
Yeah.
So how do we make sure they're not just making existing inequalities worse?
Well, I think that's where the real challenge lies. It's not enough to just say, hey, we're diverse. We have to address the systemic issues that contribute to inequality.
Right.
And this is where I think UNESCO's World Heritage Education Program is doing some really interesting work. They're all about encouraging young people to get involved in protecting cultural and natural heritage.
Okay, now that's an interesting connection. How do you see that playing out in international schools?
You just imagine students from all over the world coming together to protect and celebrate the heritage of the country they're living in.
I like it.
It could be anything, like restoring a historical site or documenting local traditions.
Right.
It's about giving them a sense of ownership, a sense of responsibility for the place they're in. And it goes way beyond the classroom. It's about making a real impact.
It's a powerful image. It's like we're not just citizens of the world, right?
Yeah.
We're also members of these specific communities, each with its own unique history and culture.
Exactly. And it's about using the resources and the global connections that these international schools have to really highlight the voices and the experiences of those local communities.
So it's not just about bringing the world into the classroom. It's about taking the classroom out into the world
Right.
and really engaging with the local community.
Exactly. And if we can do that, well, maybe we can create a whole new model for international education, one that's truly rooted in both global and local contexts.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We talked about how tricky it is to even define what international means. We looked at the economic power of these schools, the unique experiences of third culture kids, and that constant push and pull between global citizenship and national identity.
It's been a fascinating conversation, and if you'll allow me, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder.
Of course.
Imagine you had the power to design the perfect international school. How would you balance all these different forces? How would you create an environment that prepares students to be citizens of the world, but also active participants in their local communities?
That's a really great question. It makes you think about the future of education in a world that's becoming more and more globalized. And I have to say, This deep dive has given me a lot to think about.
As always, the learning never really stops, does it? This is just the start of the conversation.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of international schools. We hope it's given you some new things to think about and maybe even inspired you to keep exploring this topic. Until next time.